My brother-in-law stood in my parents' living room holding a folder of papers, and before anyone asked me a single question, my father pointed at the door and said, "Get out of this house." I'm 32 years old. I work as a forensic document examiner for a private legal firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. My job is to determine whether signatures are forged, whether dates have been altered, whether paper and ink tell the same story they claim to tell. I spend my days proving that documents don't lie even when people do, which makes what my family did to me in that living room almost darkly funny when I look back on it now. My sister had been married for 6 years to a man I'll call her husband because that's all he was to me. My sister's husband. He was the kind of person who filled every room with the sound of his own opinions and called it conversation. My sister had always been the family favorite, the one who got called first with good news, the one whose problems got treated like emergencies. I was the one who showed up, did the work, and got thanked when it was convenient. My sister's husband had been running a private construction business for 3 years. It was doing badly. I knew this not because anyone told me, but because I noticed things. The way he stopped talking about new contracts at family dinners, the way my sister deflected when anyone asked how business was going, the way he looked at me sometimes across the table like I was a problem he hadn't figured out how to solve yet. 3 months before my father pointed at the door, my sister's husband had asked me a professional favor. A vendor he worked with had given him a contract to review, and he said something about the dates feeling off to him. Said he just wanted a second set of eyes, nothing formal. I looked at it over a weekend, told him the date on the signature page appeared inconsistent with the paper stock, and that he should get a formal analysis done before signing anything. I told him to walk away. He thanked me and said he'd handle it. He did not walk away. He signed the contract, the deal collapsed 4 weeks later, and somewhere between the collapse and the moment my father pointed at the door, my sister's husband decided that I was the reason it had all gone wrong. My sister stood beside him in that living room with her arms crossed and told my parents that I had given her husband deliberately bad advice to sabotage the deal. That I had a conflict of interest because I knew the other party, that I had led him toward the contract on purpose knowing it would fail. My mother sat very still with her hands folded in her lap. My father didn't sit at all. He stood with his jaw set like the verdict was already in, and this was just the sentencing. I said I had told him not to sign it. My sister said I was lying. My father said, "I don't know what's gotten into you, but you don't do this to family." Then he pointed at the door. I drove home with my hands steady on the wheel because I have spent years learning how to hold myself together when things break around me. The steadiness is not calm, it's practice. I got inside my apartment, sat on the kitchen floor for a while, and then made myself eat something because collapsing on an empty stomach is just collapsing with a headache. My closest friend, whose name I'll call the only person who told me the truth, she went by a nickname anyway. Everyone called her Ro. Called that night because she had a way of knowing when something had happened without being told. I gave her the short version. She gave me 4 words back. "Don't you dare disappear." She came over the next morning with 2 coffees and the specific energy of someone who had already decided what needed to happen before she walked through the door. She sat across from me at my kitchen table, pushed 1 cup toward me and said, "Start from the contract, not from the living room. From the contract." So I did. When I finished, Ro leaned back in her chair and said, "He didn't make a mistake. He made a choice. And your sister helped him point it at you." Then she said, "So stop asking why they believed him and start asking what he needed them to believe and why he needed it right now." That question mattered more than I understood in that moment. I went to work the following Monday and did my job, which is easier to do when you are furious because precision requires focus, and I had plenty of that. I examined 3 sets of disputed contracts that week, wrote 2 reports, and somewhere in the middle of Tuesday afternoon, I opened my archived files and looked at the photo I had taken of the vendor contract before I handed it back to my sister's husband. I take photos of everything. It's a professional habit. Altered documents, discarded originals, contracts that someone decides they don't need anymore after a deal goes south. I photograph them the way other people save receipts, out of reflex, because I have seen too many times what happens when the only copy belongs to the person with the most to lose. I had photographed every page of that contract the afternoon he brought it to me, which meant I had, sitting in a folder on my work cloud, dated photographs of a document that my sister's husband was now claiming I had recommended to him as sound, when my written notes in the margins of my personal copies said the opposite clearly. I had made margin notes too, because of course I had. I did not do anything with this immediately, because having evidence and knowing when to use it are two completely different skills, and I had learned that the hard way in this field. I called my mother 2 days after the living room. She answered, which surprised me. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. She said she wanted me to understand how serious the financial damage had been. I said I wanted her to understand that I had told him not to sign it. She said, "He says you told him the opposite." I said, "One of us is lying." She went quiet for a moment and then said, "This is very hard for the family." I said, "It's hard for me too." She said, "He's been like a son to us." I hung up, not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left in that sentence worth answering. Roe had a contact in the commercial real estate industry, a woman who had been adjacent to Charlotte's construction and development circles for 15 years. The kind of person who attended every event and remembered every conversation, not because she was ambitious, but because she was genuinely interested in how things connected. Roe called her, mentioned the vendor involved in the contract, and by Thursday evening we were meeting her for dinner at a quiet Italian place near the University District. She was warm and careful in the way people are when they know more than they're certain they should share. She ordered a glass of water and picked at a bread roll and did not rush. I asked what she knew about the vendor in question. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That company has settled 2 contract disputes in the last 18 months. Neither of them went to litigation." She said that like she was telling me the weather. I asked if anyone in my sister's husband's circle would have known that. She set down the bread and said, "Anyone who did 5 minutes of research would have known that." My chest went cold. I kept my voice level. "How accessible is that information?" She looked at me steadily. "For someone in your line of work? It's in the public commercial filings." She paused. "For someone who wanted to find a scapegoat after the fact, it's also in the public commercial filings." Rose said nothing. She didn't need to. On the drive home I said, "He knew before he signed it." Rose said, or someone told him after, and he adjusted the story. Either way, the contract had not failed because of me. The next morning I called a colleague I trusted, someone I'll refer to as my senior partner, because she had been in this field for 20 years and had a way of listening that made you careful about what you actually meant to say before you said it. I described the situation without names, just the shape of it. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "If you have documentation of your original recommendation and he's claiming otherwise, that's not a dispute about advice. That's a dispute about fact. And facts have records." She said, "What do you have?" I told her. She said, "Then, you're not actually fighting your family. You're waiting for them to catch up to the paperwork." I sat with that for a few days. I was staying in my apartment, going to work, eating meals, sleeping adequately. I had stopped checking messages from extended family members who had begun texting with varying degrees of gentle pressure and concern. All of it pointed in the same direction, which was toward me accepting some version of fault and making things easier for everyone. I recognized this pattern. It is very common in families where one person's comfort has always been purchased at another person's expense. What happened next came from a direction I had not anticipated. My sister's husband's former business partner, I'll call him the one who left, had parted ways with my sister's husband about 8 months before the failed contract. The split had been quiet. No litigation, no public explanation, just a name removed from the company registration and a mutual agreement to stop being involved. I had met him once at a company event years earlier. He had seemed like someone who kept his own counsel and chose his words the way you choose which items to pack for a trip you might not come back from. He found me. He sent a message through a professional network, brief and factual. He said he had heard what was being said about me in connection with the contract. He said he thought I should know that the vendor in question had been on his radar for reasons that predated my involvement. He said, "If it's useful, I kept records." I replied the same afternoon. "It's useful." We met at a coffee shop 2 days later. He brought a folder. Inside it was a chain of email correspondence between himself and my sister's husband from over a year before the contract, in which he had flagged the same vendor as a risk, cited the prior settlements, and recommended they add them to a list of parties to avoid. My sister's husband had replied at the time that he would take it under advisement. He had not taken it under advisement. He had signed a contract with the same vendor 10 months later, and then told my family I had encouraged him to do it. I sat with that folder in my hands and felt something settle in me that had been loose and rattling around since the living room. Not anger. Something quieter. The particular stillness that comes when the thing you knew was true becomes the thing you can prove. He said, "I'm not trying to get involved in a family situation, but I'm not going to let someone take the blame for something I could have prevented if I'd spoken up sooner." I told him I appreciated that. He said, "I left that company because this kind of thing had already started to be a pattern, making decisions and then restructuring the narrative around them." That was useful too. I went home that evening and spread everything across my kitchen table, my margin-noted copy of the contract, the photographs I had taken, the prior settlement records from public commercial filings, the email chain the former business partner had brought. I looked at all of it for a long time and thought about what I actually wanted, not what would feel good in the moment, not the version where I forwarded everything to my father that same night and waited for his phone to light up. Not even the version where my sister finally had to say the thing she had been protected from having to say her entire life. I wanted to stop being the story my sister's husband was telling. And the only way to stop being someone else's story is to make the documented version loud enough that the told version can't survive next to it. Ro helped me build the package. She had a background in communications before she switched careers, and she understood how presentation shapes reception. We wrote a cover letter. Not emotional, not defensive, precisely chronological. It stated that I had been accused of providing advice that contributed to a business loss. It stated that I had documentation showing the advice I had actually provided. It stated that public records showed the vendor had been involved in prior settlements. It stated that prior correspondence from a former business partner showed the risk had been flagged independently. It attached everything in order with dates. I addressed it to my father, my mother, and my sister. I did not address it to my sister's husband because he already knew what was in it, and my goal was not to inform him. I sent it at 7:43 in the morning. My phone was silent until 9. Then it started. "My sister. You went behind my back. My mother. We need to talk before this goes any further. My father. Call me." Then, 20 minutes later, from my father again. "This doesn't look good for him." I did not respond to any of them. I went to work. I examined a disputed signature on a real estate transfer. I ate lunch at my desk. I answered 3 client emails. At 3 in the afternoon, my mother called and I let her leave a voicemail. She said, "Your father wants to meet." She said, "We had no idea about the previous settlements." She said, "We need to understand how this happened." That last sentence bothered me more than the others. We need to understand how this happened, as if the mechanics of the situation were the issue, as if the part where they pointed at the door without asking me a single question was just a procedural error. I went to the meeting because I have never been someone who avoids the rooms that are hardest to enter. My father sat at the kitchen table with the folder I had sent in front of him. My mother stood near the counter with her hands folded. My sister was not there. My father looked older than he had in the living room, not because of time, because of what happens to a face when the version of events it was holding stops being the one that's true. He said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "Yes." He waited, I think, for me to fill in something softer around that yes. I didn't. He said, "We should have asked you." I said, "You didn't ask me anything. You pointed at the door." My mother said, "We were frightened for your sister. Her husband had been telling us for weeks that the business problems were connected to advice he had gotten from you. By the time you were in that room, I said, you had already decided. I know. That's the part that isn't about the documents. My father looked at the folder, he said. He's been lying to us too, about how the business was going, about how the other contracts, about a lot of things." I said, "I know." He said, "How did you know?" I said, "Because I looked at the paperwork." The silence in that kitchen lasted a long time. My mother asked if I would consider coming back for Sunday dinners again. I thought about the living room. I thought about my father's voice, saying the words, "I don't know what's gotten into you." I thought about my mother sitting with her hands folded and not asking one question. I said, "I'll think about it." I meant, "Not yet." They understood. I could tell by the way neither of them pushed. My sister called that night from a number I still picked up out of reflex. She didn't apologize. She said she had not fully known what her husband had told our parents. She said things between them had gotten complicated. She said she was sorry for how I had been treated. I noticed she did not say she was sorry for standing next to him in that living room with her arms crossed. I said, "I hear you." She said, "I want to fix this." I said, "Fixing it looks different than apologizing for the version that makes it easiest for you." She went quiet. I kept going. "You stood next to him. You didn't ask me either. That's not something he did to me. That's something you both did." She said, "I know." I said, "I need some time." She said, "Okay." It was the most honest conversation we had ever had, and it was only honest because I had stopped trying to hold it together for her. My sister's husband tried once. He texted asking if I could let things settle without escalating further. I looked at the message for a while before replying. I said I didn't escalate anything. I documented what happened. If those are the same thing to you, that's something you should think about. Then I blocked his number. He was removed from 2 industry referral networks within the following month. I did not do that. What I had sent to my family was private, addressed to 3 people. What happened after that was a combination of the former business partner making his own decisions about what to share, and the vendor's own prior settlements finally catching up to them in a separate dispute that had nothing to do with me. Information moves in professional circles the way water moves through old pipes, slowly and then all at once. My senior partner at the firm called me into her office one afternoon and said she had heard my name mentioned in connection with something related to a construction contract dispute. She looked at me steadily and said, "I want to make sure nothing about that situation needs to come inside these walls." I told her the shape of it. She said, "You handled that exactly the way someone in this field should handle anything that touches their professional credibility." She said, "If anyone asks about your competence in this matter, I will be the first to respond." I nearly said something embarrassing. I kept it together. Ro came over that weekend, and we painted the accent wall in my living room a deep, dusty blue that she said looked like the inside of a good decision. She brought a level and a set of good brushes, and we did it properly, which took 4 hours. Somewhere in hour 2, she said, "You know what I keep thinking?" I said, "What?" She said, "You work with documents all day that people tampered with and lied about. And then you came home and the same thing happened in your own family. There's something almost impressive about how badly that backfired on them." I laughed for the first time in weeks. The wall looked good. I bought a plant and put it near the window, one of those wide-leafed ones that doesn't need a lot of fuss, and I started sleeping through the night again by the end of that month. My father texted a few weeks later. He said he had ended the professional relationship he had with my sister's husband. They had shared a financial advisor, and my father had quietly separated that arrangement. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. The text read, "I wanted you to know." I wrote back, "Thank you for telling me." That was the most straightforward exchange we had ever had, and it was better than any apology. My sister and I have spoken a few times since. It is not the same. I don't know if it will be. What I know is that she is dealing with a marriage that was already cracked in more places than the failed contract revealed. And I am no longer available to fill those cracks by making myself smaller. That's not estrangement. It's just honesty, finally. After years of being the one who managed the distance so that no one else had to feel it. The former business partner sent me one final message a few months later. It said, "I heard things have settled somewhat. I hope you're well. I appreciated you handling this the way you did." I wrote back, "Thank you for bringing the folder." He replied, "Documents don't choose sides, they just remember." I thought about that for a long time after. My job is built on the idea that paper holds things people can't, not because paper is more reliable than memory, but because memory is always reshaping itself toward whatever the person carrying it most needs to believe. Documents don't need anything. They just sit there, dated and witnessed, until someone finally reads them correctly. My family needed a story that made sense of a loss they didn't understand and weren't ready to examine. My sister's husband gave them one. It was clean and available, and it had a face attached to it, mine, which made it easy to deliver to people who were already frightened and already looking for somewhere to put it. What he didn't account for was that I photograph everything, not out of suspicion, out of habit, out of years of learning that the space between what happened and what people remember happening is exactly wide enough for a lie to live comfortably. I close that space for a living. I just hadn't expected to have to close it in my parents' kitchen. People ask me sometimes after a story like this whether I forgave my family. I think that question gets asked too soon and too simply. Forgiveness isn't something you dispense like a verdict. It's something that happens slowly in the space where you used to carry the thing that was done to you, and you only notice it when the weight shifts. What I can tell you is that I stopped carrying the accusation the night I sent the folder. Not because they apologized. They were slow about that and incomplete, but because the version of events that had been sitting on my chest since the living room finally had somewhere else to be. In the documents. In the dates. In the margins where I had written, clearly and without ambiguity, "Do not sign this." I didn't go back to Sunday dinners right away. I'm still figuring out what going back looks like, or whether back is even the right direction. Some doors, when they close on you, open onto something better. The carriage house in the story I loved hearing as a kid always belonged to the person who stopped waiting to be let back into the main house. My apartment has a blue wall now. It has a plant that doesn't need much. It has a kitchen table where I once sat with every piece of documentation that cleared my name, and where I now sit with coffee on Sunday mornings, reading, with nobody who can suddenly decide I don't belong here. That's enough. More than enough, actually. And if you're wondering whether I would do it again, go through all of it to find the proof, send the folder, say no when they ask me to make it easy, the answer is yes, without hesitation. Not because it felt good, not because it fixed everything, but because the alternative was spending the rest of my life being the version of me that my sister's husband invented in a room where no one thought to ask me one question. That version was never going to survive contact with the photograph of a margin note. Neither was the lie. I've thought a lot about what actually caused all of this, and I don't mean the contract, I mean the pattern underneath it. The thing that made it possible for my brother-in-law to walk into my parents' living room with a folder of half-truths and have it work. The answer, when I finally got honest with myself about it, was that I had spent years being the reliable one. The one who showed up. The one who fixed things quietly and never made it anyone's problem. And somewhere in that long stretch of being dependable, I had become the person in the family who could absorb blame without anyone worrying too much that they pushed too hard. That's not a character flaw. It's just what happens when you keep accepting the weight without ever setting it down. People stop noticing it's heavy. What my brother-in-law understood, whether consciously or not, was that I was a clean surface to write on. I had no history of causing trouble, no prior accusations, no drama, which meant that when he needed somewhere to put the story of a failed contract, I was the most convincing option available. The irony is that every quality that made me a good forensic examiner, patience, precision, the habit of documenting everything, was also what made me the worst possible person to try to frame. He had picked someone who photographs margin notes as a professional reflex, and then acted surprised when the margin notes survived. That's the thing about actions. They don't disappear just because nobody's looking at them. My brother-in-law made a decision to sign a contract he had been warned about twice by two different people. He made a second decision to restructure the story around that choice. He made a third decision to put my name in the center of that story. Each of those choices had a shape, and each shape left evidence, and the evidence didn't care how convincingly he told the other version. The documents sat there, dated and patient, until someone read them in the right order. I think about Ro bringing coffee the morning after and saying start from the contract, not from the living room. That was the most intelligent thing anyone said to me during the entire situation. Because the living room was emotional. The living room was about my father's face and my sister's crossed arms and the sound of a door being pointed at. If I had stayed in the living room, I would have spent weeks circling my own hurt without ever getting close to the thing that could actually change anything. Moving back to the contract moved me from the story someone else was telling into the facts I could actually work with. That shift from emotional reaction to methodical examination is what made everything else possible. I'm not saying feelings don't matter. They do. I sat on my kitchen floor that first night, and that mattered. I needed to feel the weight of what had happened before I could do anything useful with it. But feelings alone don't clear a name. Feelings alone don't produce a dated photograph of a margin note that says clearly, "Do not sign this." Intelligence without honesty about what you're feeling is just cold. But honesty about what you're feeling, without the discipline to eventually set it down and pick up something more useful, just keeps you in the living room forever. What I want anyone to take from this, if they're in something similar, is that integrity is not just a moral quality, it is a practical one. I documented that contract not because I suspected anything, but because that is simply how I work. That habit, built over years of quiet professional discipline, is what saved me. Not luck, not timing, not a dramatic confrontation. A folder, a photograph, a habit of keeping records. The truth was there the whole time. I just needed to make sure everyone else finally had to look at it. My father eventually said, "You didn't cause the divorce, the business loss." He corrected himself. "The point is the same." And I said, "I know." I said it without triumph, because by then the triumph had already happened quietly weeks earlier at my kitchen table when I spread the documents out and understood that the story was already over. Everyone else just needed more time to catch up.